Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very happy Thursday to everyone. It's great to be welcoming you all to our another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. Especially a warm welcome to those of you joining us for the very first time, but again, welcome to those of you returning for another lecture. Now, today we're really excited because we're joined by Clare Price from the 20th Century Society, who's going to be talking to us about the element of surprise church design in the 20th century. And I've seen some of the slides already, and I know some of the churches that are going to be talked about, and they are really fantastic and really interesting today. But as is usually the case, we're going to be doing Church of the Week very shortly. And that's where our Chief Executive will be talking to you about a particular church in our care. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass you on to our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, after a very quick little video.
The Church's Conservation Trust brings you Church of the Week.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Church of the Week. I'm very grateful to the Royal School of Church Music who created that jingle for us, and I am also extremely grateful to Ecclesiastical Insurance who sponsor Church of the Week and support our lunchtime lectures. So let's share today's church. So today's church is not a 20th century church, because that is the subject of our talk today, because we don't have any 20th century churches in the Church's Conservation Trust collection. It is a big miss, I think, but this is one of our youngest churches, having been designed in 1878 and built between 1878 and 1880, and it is a genuine Victorian gem of St Mary's, South Tidworth in Wiltshire. So I try and move my cursor on a bit. St Mary's is a fine Victorian church rebuilt by Sir John Kelk, who was here with us between 1816 and 1886, one of the greatest 19th century contractors who constructed important railways and docks, as well as many houses and churches in London. In the 1870s, Kelk purchased the famous sporting estate of Tidworth and set about remodelling Tidworth House. His architect was John Johnson, whom he'd employed on many other works, including the Alexandra Palace. Johnson had designed about a dozen churches in and around London from the 1850s, but Tidworth Church was to be his last. Here you will see the needle-like spire at the west end, which houses a single Sanctus bell. The south porch has exceptionally rich decoration to the outer doorway, including lovely stiff leaf foliage capitals in the 13th century manner. Excuse me, yes, definitely 13th century. The inner door is somewhat simpler. The carving was done by a distinguished London firm of Farmer and Brindley. The nave is extremely tall and is covered by a keel-shaped roof. On either side are pairs of quatrefold piers, again of Devon marble with stiff leaf capitals. The seats are typical Victorian pews, but they carry now rare candle standards, which were converted to electrical bulbs. From here we can see that the aisles have half arches marking out the bays. The chancel is embellished by a fine mosaic floor that originates from Italy. Above the altar, which is raised up on 4 steps, is a large square reredos showing Christ carrying the cross to Calvary. Above, the stained glass is a 3-light east window, shows the adoration by the shepherds, the crucifixion, and the supper at Emmaus. The chancel roof is keeled like that in the nave, but here the 3 bays are filled with decorated panels depicting sacred emblems. The eastern bay is richer than the other 2 in order to give honour to the sanctuary below. The decoration is by the notable firm of London ecclesiastical decorators Heaton, Butler and Bain. The church was declared redundant in 1972, and in 1973, which was a very good year, it was vested in the care of the Redundant Churches Fund, which is now the Church's Conservation Trust, and we're very proud to have this building in our collection. It is a very fine building. If you're in Wiltshire, do step in and have a look. The level of the quality of the finishes to this building are extremely high. Although this building is referred to sometimes by people as redundant or closed, it is full of life and very much loved by the community. People even get married here, and here you can see it, although you do need an archbishop's license to do so, and I hope that many of you will be tempted to go and visit it. All of our buildings remain consecrated, and it's really important that services and life events still continue to take place in these buildings along with visitors. Thank you very much. Over to you, George. I can't hear you, George.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry, everyone. So we're going into question time with our chief exec. So, Peter, one of the questions I suppose we ought to ask is that you mentioned at the start that we don't have any 20th century churches at the moment. Do you think this might change?
Well, I hope so, because there's a very fine collection of 20th century churches across the country, and I think it's a shame for our collection not to include something from the 20th century itself. I mean, we don't get to decide which buildings come to us. That is in the gift of the church commissioners, and it does depend on buildings being of sufficient architectural quality in order to come into our collection. But I am very interested and always on the lookout for interesting 20th century churches which might come into our care.
Thanks, Peter. And I suppose, well, as you just said there, we'll keep an eye out. So if anyone sees any particular churches that they think have any concerns about, do let us know. But it's been really interesting, everyone. Over the last few weeks, we've been posting on Facebook posts about 20th century churches, and we've loved seeing the debate. It's an issue clearly that some people really love these buildings, some people aren't so sure about them. But hopefully, as a result of today's lecture, we'll all have a deeper understanding and appreciation for these wonderful, wonderful places. So, Peter, another question I suppose that I ought to ask. Someone asked a few weeks ago, there's a lot of asks from different charities for people's resource at the moment. We might be going into another period of austerity. Why should people support our work? And why do churches now, more than ever perhaps, need more love and attention?
But I think it's a case of these buildings, as you've often heard me say, I think are very significant cultural landmarks in the country. They tell a story of a place like no other building does, and actually they're extremely democratic in that they belong to everybody, really, in essence. And the only way they can be kept going is really by the love and care of the local community, regardless of whether there's any schemes of funding from national organisations or the government. Actually, these buildings do require people to use and love them, and who live locally in their communities. And that love can be all sorts of different things. It could be giving your time, giving your knowledge and your experience, or giving money towards these particular buildings. Regardless of what happens, they always do require cash to keep them up. But surprisingly, there's not a lot of money that's needed to keep the cyclical maintenance going on a particular building. We reckon about £2,000 a year. You can keep a building of reasonable size, keep the cyclical maintenance going on that building. Obviously, we've got teams of people who are there to support people, also look after their buildings and support communities do that, and our conservation expertise, of course. And so we do have an overhead to the work that we do. And it's always important that we're raising more money and finding ways to do that and have your support. But you can support us in lots of different ways, as I said before, by volunteering or taking part, giving your skills and experience, as well as money. But joining us is a really good way of getting involved in the work of the Church's Conservation Trust. It'll cost you about £3.50 a month to be a member, although you can join some of our other tiers of membership, which provide us with more funding depending on what resources you have available. And by being a member, you give us that great bit of support. One, knowing that you're there supporting us, but also your money helps fix these buildings and keep them in good repair into the future. And I think they are important. They are important to our lives. They give us a sense of place, and it's really important that we pass them on to the next generation, and we're very determined to do that.
Thanks, Peter. And everyone, thank you so much for your questions. That brings us to the end of question time for this week. I know there has been one question that came in at the start was obviously St Mary's South Tidworth that Peter just talked about is our youngest church. Someone's asked what is our oldest? Let me do some research because there's a couple of contenders. We've got St Werburgh up in Warburton. Now, that's one of only 39 timber-framed churches left on the British Isles. It's a really fantastic church. I did a live stream there a few weeks ago, and we're going to be doing some conservation work possibly there in the coming months. So that's a contender. We did some dendrocarbon dating on the timbers, and some of them are almost 1,000 years older timbers there. Another really ancient church on an ancient site is St Andrew's, Wroxeter. Now, that's a champing church. You can actually sleep in that church overnight. But some of the columns in the church porch are Roman. They've from a Roman building that was on the site. So let me do some further digging, and I'll try and get a definitive answer for you for what is our oldest church. But again, everyone, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for our lunchtime lecture. Please let us know if you're joining us for the first time, but let us know where you're watching from. It's really great to be welcoming everyone today. So I'm just going to do a quick tech overview before I pass you back to Peter, who will introduce the lecture and get things underway. So this has been live streamed onto Facebook. We are making a recording. So if there are any lagging issues and anything jumps, don't worry, because we'll be uploading a really smooth recording, which should resolve or any problems we're having with that. Now, if you see anyone commenting with links saying you could watch a lecture elsewhere, please don't click them. Our lectures are always 100% free of charge, and we only at the moment live stream to Facebook, but we are working on a fix to get it onto YouTube at the same time very soon. But if you've got any questions, please do comment away. Now, as Peter said, there are a couple of ways you can support us. You can volunteer with us. You can, get involved with the local community and really get involved with one of our churches as a volunteer. But you could also do it in a couple of ways. You could firstly like and share these lectures. You could like and follow our Facebook account. But also you could please consider making a donation to support our really important work of conserving and protecting, at the moment, 356 historic churches across the country. Now, Peter mentioned that you can become a member with us from just £3.50. Now, if you do that by direct debit, so that's £3.50 a month, and if you use the offer code LECTURE, and that's lecture in capitals, you will receive a free copy of this. Hopefully you can all see that. This is our brand new member book. So if you, as I said, sign up as a member from just £3.50 a month, you'll get a free copy of this. We've currently sold out. So we've ordered a special print run of this new book. And that's going to be delivered to us in June. And we're hoping to send these, in July. And we're hoping to send these out in early August. But this book is fantastic. It's got full page illustrations throughout. And it's a really great primer for understanding churches. And it's a great book to accompany, we think, our lectures, because our lectures have been so diverse. We've talked about chantry tombs, we've talked about saints, we've talked about stained glass. This book covers all of these topics. So it's a really great book. And the author, Dr. Richard Stemp, kindly did a lecture for us several weeks ago, and he's coming back to do a few more for us later on this year. Also, if you would like to, today, we're doing a special offer on this book, which is 100 Churches, 100 Years, which was created by the 20th Century Society and was edited in part by Clare, who's giving today's lecture. So this is the book to accompany today's lecture, and it is fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough. I've really enjoyed looking throughout it. It's got great photography throughout, wonderful descriptions about different churches and cathedrals that have been built since 1914. Normally the RRP for this book is £25. We're selling it for just £20 plus postage and packaging. Now, if you buy it through us, not only are you helping us to conserve historic churches, but also you're helping, as I said, the 20th Century Society, who published this book, because they get royalties from the sales of this book. So we'll comment the links there. So if you'd like to buy it, you may do so. But I'm going to pass you over to Peter again, our Chief Executive, who's going to tell you a bit more about the Trust. I'm just going to quickly put up, everyone, my Twitter handle, because it's been great over the last week, people tweeting us when you go out to our churches. Keep tweeting those. We've loved seeing your pictures. So that's my Twitter handle there, GReynolds1989, and I'll put Peter's up in a minute. But if you've got any questions, any technical problems, please do comment away or send us a direct message, and we'll do our best to help you out. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, George, and hello, everybody. As you're probably aware, is welcome back to all of those people who are regular attenders, and welcome to anyone who's new. Hope you enjoy today's lecture. The Church's Conservation Trust has been around for just over 50 years, and we look after historic places of worship that are of significant historic or architectural value that no longer have a viable congregation, and we hold them on behalf of the nation in perpetuity. We've got a collection of 356 of these buildings across the country, and we take on about 2 or 3 more every year. As you can see, that's an important thing, to take on more of these buildings. We grow all the time, but obviously that does take money and investment to make sure that we can keep them all, because eventually they all start needing repair again, no matter how well you maintain them, which we do very well. So your support is always welcome. So please do consider joining the Trust and taking advantage of that opportunity to get that free book. But also you can make a donation, which is very helpful. And also, as you've been told today, we're selling the book 100 Churches in 100 Years, which is a fantastic contribution, not only towards our work, but also towards the work of the 20th Century Society. So I'm really pleased to welcome Clare Price today, who's the head of casework at the 20th Century Society, and she's been working there since 2012. And she's responsible for all the Society's church casework across the UK and secular buildings in the North and West London boroughs, as well as selected home counties, North East England, East Anglia and Scotland. So the 20th Century Society is a society which comments on applications for alterations or demolitions of important 20th century buildings, and they play a very important role protecting this particular age of architecture, when good examples can be easily lost if people don't realise their significance. Claire's also let us know that she's researching her DPhil at University of Oxford, with a particular focus, we're pleased to hear, on interwar church architecture. I was asking her how much time she was spending on this, and she said it depends who you ask, but it is quite a big undertaking, and generally shows that she's very jolly clever if she's doing that sort of work. She already holds an MSc in Conservation of Historic Environment and is a qualified chartered surveyor. Claire's worked in commercial property and building conservation for over 20 years, and prior to joining the 20th Century Society, she worked for an international firm of chartered surveyors and subsequently as a freelance consultant. So we're really pleased to have her here today, and I'd really like to say a huge thank you to Clare for giving her time free to put on a lecture for the Church's Conservation Trust, and for that we're eternally grateful. But for now, I'd like to introduce Clare Price, who's going to give today's lecture. Thank you very much, Clare.
Hello, thank you very much, Peter. I'll just share my screen. I hope everybody can see that all right. So yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak in your lecture series. It's very exciting to be able to showcase some of the interesting things that happened during the 20th century in church design, and something maybe that isn't often seen in lecture series like this. So I'm going to start at the very beginning of the century, and the selection of churches I've chosen is somewhat eclectic. Not all of them feature in the book 100 Churches, 100 Years, but the idea is really to give you a taste of all the different things that were happening during the century. So in 1902, the results of a prestigious architectural competition were announced. The Church of England Diocese of Liverpool had needed a new cathedral since it had been formed in 1880. The results of the competition were something of a shock. The winning design was by a 22-year-old Roman Catholic architect, Giles Gilbert Scott. Despite coming from architectural royalty, his father being George Gilbert Scott, the Cathedral Committee were not at all convinced that he could do the job and would only proceed if Scott's design had the oversight of one of the assessors, G.F. Bodley. They had no idea, of course, that the construction of this cathedral was to end up spanning almost 3/4 of the 20th century through a bold redesign when Bodley died in 1907, 2 world wars, and a stylistic and liturgical revolution. On completion, the cathedral was the biggest church in Britain and the 5th largest in the world. John Betjeman summed it up as follows: "This is one of the great buildings of the world. The impression of vastness, strength, and height no words can describe." So Liverpool Cathedral is located at one end of Hope Street in Liverpool. If you climb up this amazing tower, you get an excellent view of the other end of the street, where sits Liverpool's other cathedral, the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Christ the King, an overtly modern church. Its circular shape intended to embrace liturgical reform. It was designed by Frederick Gibbard and dates from 1960 to 67. But I'm not going to say any more about Paddy's Wigwam, as it is affectionately known in Liverpool, as John Wright is going to be here in a couple of weeks' time to tell you much more about it than I can. Suffice to say that Hope Street in Liverpool is my favourite place to start to give you a flavour of the different styles and layouts of churches in the century. So the key characteristics of the 20th century are the range and diversity of churches and church fittings that were designed during the period. It was a great period of change, not just in appearance, but also in approach. Peter Anson called the first part of the century chaotic eclecticism, and he did not live to see the impact of the liturgical reform movement on the architecture in the second half of the century. Many of the churches that I'm going to show you today, but not all, are in the recent book 100 Churches, 100 Years. And the title of my talk mentions surprise. My aim is to surprise you in 3 ways. Firstly, in just how widespread the influence of the 20th century is. Secondly, in how unexpectedly diverse it can be. And thirdly, by giving you a flavour of how significant the changes in church design were during the century. In 1936, Arthur Mee coined the term thankful villages to describe those villages that escaped without any losses from the First World War. At the time, Mee identified 32 villages, but recent research has found even more. So it's believed there are now 54 such villages in the UK. Of those, only about 14 were what is known as doubly thankful, and having no losses in the Second World War either. So why am I telling you this? Well, of the 16,000 parishes in the country, that means that almost every single one turned their minds to commemorating their dead. The First World War created a massive amount of work in terms of church fittings. Almost every church commissioned a war memorial. And they're also the thankful villages, where they actually erected memorials in thanks for their deaths. These memorials took a variety of forms. Very often donations were fittings, such as altar rails, screens, reredos. Some added chapels, and also entire churches were constructed as memorials. The 20th century truly touched every church in the country. Indeed, the formalisation of the system of diocesan advisory committees was in fact due to the need to control the proliferation of such memorials, after there was concern that they were a disfigurement to the interiors of churches. After the First World War, there was an abiding sympathy still with medieval work, even though the highly decorated Victorian interpretation had fallen out of fashion and favour. This screen in Holy Trinity Minchin Hampton in Gloucestershire was installed as a war memorial in 1920. It was designed by one of the most accomplished designers of church interiors in the interwar period, F.C. Eden. Eden has been somewhat overlooked by historians, as only 2 of his new church designs were built, despite being highly influential and greatly respected during his lifetime. Having trained in the offices of Butterfield and Bodley, he spent his entire career as a sole practitioner. He worked closely with his friends Sir Ninian Comper and Sir Charles Nicholson. Eden was acutely aware of the relevance of context and the need to respect historic fabric. After his travels in France brought home to him the damage that could be done by extreme restorations. Eden's reputation for fine work explains his popularity in the earlier 20th century. As Edward Hager has commented in his paper on Eden in the journal 20th Century Architecture 3, he had an enviable reputation of never putting a foot wrong. The screen at Minchinhampton is designed and executed to a very high standard, as was all his work. The screen and rood are particularly significant within Eden's oeuvre as one of the very few that were unpainted. As can be seen from the chancel ceiling decoration, Eden favoured the use of colour in his projects. He returned to Minchinhampton to paint the chancel ceiling 10 years after the screen. Eden was great friends with Sir Ninian Comper, someone who cannot be left out of any survey of 20th century churches. Here we see St Mary Wellingborough. Comper's philosophy of church design moved away from the medieval idiom to his own unique style based on a carefully researched use of a variety of elements from different periods, which he named unity by inclusion. St Mary's has been seen as the culmination of all his ideas, as here he was able to use all of the elements of unity by inclusion. The church took over 26 years to complete. The chancel screen that you can see in this image epitomises his approach. Begun in 1925, decoration of the screen continued until 1950. And in it, Comper uses classical arches to add details of Italianate and Spanish influence, acanthus and dragons from Greek sources, and ironwork following the Reja traditions in Spain. Comper was deliberately an anti-establishment figure and ploughed his own furrow when it came to developing his ideas of the correct approach to church design. His work was unparalleled in its beauty and originality, but he was dismissed by many later commentators, such as Nicholas Pesner, who considered a complete break from the past to be a necessity in new design. J.M. Richards summed up Comper's work as the last flowering of the Gothic revival. In contrast, Sir Charles Nicholson was completely the opposite of Comper, in that he was entirely part of the establishment. He was a prolific designer who should be more widely appreciated, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he also wrote about his views throughout the period. Here, in his 1914 church of St Alban Copner in Portsmouth, Nicholson employed a Jacobean theme for his interior furnishing. Here we see the elaborate wooden painted chancel screen, which was relocated in 2019. Sir Charles Nicholson was one of the architects involved in the provision of memorial fittings. He was one of the most prolific church architects in the first half of the 20th century. This is his scheme of screen and chancel fittings for Leicester Cathedral. This was installed when it was elevated to cathedral status in 1927. Leicester Cathedral was the most complete example of Nicholson's work and one of his most prominent commissions. Leicester was also the only one of his cathedral schemes to be fully realised. It was highly thought of at the time. There is little published research on Nicholson's work, and he is currently very undervalued. Somewhat denuded since this photograph was taken, because Leicester Cathedral needed to squeeze a Richard III in somewhere. Nicholson is actually a very good example of how ubiquitous 20th century design is in churches in Britain. Apart from Leicester, Nicholson's work, not just fittings and restorations, but complete new churches, can be found in Avon, Belfast, Berkshire, Brecon, Bristol, Buckinghamshire, Cambridgeshire, Cardiff, Cheshire, Cleveland, Clwyd, Cornwall, Cumbria, Derbyshire, Devon, Dorset, Durham, Essex, Flint, Glamorgan, Gloucestershire, Hampshire, Hertfordshire, the Isle of Wight, Kent, Lancashire, Lincolnshire, London, Middlesex, Norfolk, Northamptonshire, Nottinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Peterborough, Shropshire, Somerset, Southwark, Staffordshire, Suffolk, Surrey, Sussex, Warwickshire, West Midlands, Wiltshire, Worcestershire, and Yorkshire. And he was only active in the first part of the century. So I hope that first section of my talk has given you an insight into how 20th century design can be found in all parts of the country in all ages of churches. Most of these examples have been in the first half of the century. My next element of surprise is to give you an idea of the diversity of design in the century, and it will skip around in time a little bit more. Interwar Roman Catholic churches were greatly influenced by Bentley's Roman Catholic Cathedral in Westminster, which had been built at the end of the 19th century. They favoured the Basilican style of church. Their interiors were richly decorated. Here at St John the Baptist, Rochdale, the apse was decorated in glorious mosaics in 1933 by Eric Newton, clearly taking their cue from Ravenna and including various different descriptions and depictions of events from the Bible. This depiction of Christ the King in the apse is perhaps one of the most glorious. Eric Newton worked across the country, installing these stunning mosaics in a variety of different settings, as diverse as Roman Catholic churches and small chapels in the centre of London. Completely different, but from the same time period, Sir Alfred Richardson used the idea of a barn to design his church in Greenford in Middlesex. Originally conceived as an extension to the existing very tiny medieval parish church, it was decided in the end to build a large independent building in the churchyard. The tiny medieval parish church could not cope with the expanding suburban development around it. Thousands of people were moving into Middlesex. Greenford was very typical in requiring a new church building at this time. If you think about the expansion of the Metroland suburbs, you will not be surprised to hear that over 250 new churches were built in the 1930s alone to cope with this suburban expansion. Nicholson's barn church was somewhat unusual. There are only 2 barn churches built in this period. He used his pine here as a material to make the frame of the church. Jumping ahead a bit, or backwards, depending on your viewpoint, this is also a Richardson church. The intervention of the war changed the architectural scene in Britain. The bombing of major cities caused church losses and the need for post-war reconstruction. 3 routes were adopted by the rebuilding commissioners: either retain the ruins as memorials, rebuild completely anew, or reconstruct. So this is St James Piccadilly. It appears to be a Wren church. It was dramatically remodelled one night in the Blitz by a German incendiary bomb, and virtually nothing remained except for its external walls. The decision here was made to rebuild in facsimile, as Wren's churches are, of course, of supreme importance. As they started the work on the church, the external walls started to collapse. Fortunately, Richardson had spent many years during the period between the wars in a project as a trainee article clerk, which involved him voluntarily sketching all the different elements of Wren's St James's Piccadilly in his own notebooks. He had drawn every bit over and over again. So he was the natural choice for the rebuilding of this church after the war. This is not the only church in London that appears on the outside and the inside to be of a much early construction than it is. But this is arguably a 20th century church, as is this, St John's Waterloo, immediately opposite Waterloo Station, a Bedford church of 1812. It was also hit by an incendiary device and completely burnt out. The front portico here is pretty much the only surviving element of the original church. The interior had to be rebuilt, caused considerable controversy before the job was given to Thomas Ford, who redesigned the church without its galleries. The choice of a lack of galleries was as much to do with economics as anything else, and the need not to have quite so much seating after the war as had been necessary beforehand. He replicated the amazing acanthus frieze and the pilasters of this church, and as well incorporated new design features, such as this amazing firebush mural behind the altar, in the altarpiece and in place of the window here. Bombing also led to the loss of Butterfield's church in Newbury and gave Stephen Dykes Bower the opportunity to design this stunning replacement, nodding to Butterfield's polychromatic brickwork, but adding his own colour and inventiveness. Another bombed church, circular, relatively hidden away, but actually located in a very central position just off Leicester Square in the heart of London. This is Notre Dame de France by Hector Corfiato from 1955, a Roman Catholic church which is circular for a somewhat unusual reason. It is built on the site of the 1793 Panorama building. The previous church, a 19th century one, was bombed in the war, and the post-war reconstruction of 1953 to 5 continued to follow the same footprint as the original Panorama building, and it incorporates an intriguing mixture of styles. This church I included because it is so unusual in its shape. It is Our Lady, Star of the Sea, and St Winfrid in Anglesey of 1937. Sometimes with 20th century churches, there was the opportunity to produce the most unusual designs. This church by Giuseppe Rinvolucri is intended to represent an upturned boat, not an unusual theme for a church perhaps, but the concrete vaults and the porthole windows for the basement meeting rooms produce an extremely peculiar building. The interior, however, is a pure and calm space with surprising radiance. Of course, radical experimentation is what the 20th century is known for. I can't do a talk without including a few of those particularly unusual churches. This is St John's Ermine in Lincoln by Sam Scorer. It's one of the few churches that features a hyperbolic paraboloid roof, and something that I usually stumble on when I'm giving these lectures, but I managed to say it today. It has the most beautiful Keith New glass in it. But today I'm about the variety in churches, and not only about the interesting and weird shapes, but about churches that were amazing at integrating themselves in the existing landscape surrounding them. One of the most amazing and interesting church designers in the 20th century was George Pace. He did some fantastic work, which was very, very contextual. He worked in the precinct of Durham Cathedral, producing a library for the university. And this is his Scargill Chapel in North Yorkshire. It is in the most beautiful setting and is part of a facility for conferences. And the wooden shingles here and the use of the local stone really helped to make this blend into the countryside. Another church that is contextual in a completely different way is the Unitarian Church in Plymouth. Perhaps this is a nod to the links with the early American settlers that left the city, because the church really does feel more New England than Old England. It was designed by Louis de Soissons, who's better known for his role in Welwyn Garden City. And I'm using that link very unsubtly to move to new towns. The push to construct new towns to house displaced populations after the war bombings also created opportunities for new church construction. And this gave the churches and their architects a chance to experiment with new arrangements of the interiors, new types of material, and ways of producing beautiful numinous spaces within budgets. So for the next couple of churches, I'm turning to the new town of Harlow. This church by Humphreys and Hurst is St Paul's, right in the centre of Harlow by the Playhouse. It has this amazing light quality of screen walls, almost entirely glazed. It's quite an early post-war church, 1959, and the entirety of the fittings in the interior are also designed by the architects. It has John Piper's first church work, a mosaic mural, which isn't in this picture, I've just realised, which depicts the House of Emmaus. Also in Harlow was a really very beautiful Catholic church of the next year, 1960, Our Lady of Fatima by Gerard Golan. This is a concrete framed church, again filled with glass, but here, instead of the white and citrus coloured glass at St Paul's, you have this amazing, beautiful, multicoloured effect. And when the sun shines through it, it's the most uplifting experience. In many ways, it emulates Perret's designs on the continent. And Charles Norris here designed glass, which has you completely surrounded by colour and beauty. So the next thing I'm going to show you is a variety of cathedrals that date from the 20th century. In the 1930s, when Guildford Cathedral was commissioned, the correspondent in the Times called the 20th century the cathedral building era, which might come slightly as a surprise because it's not really well known for its cathedrals. A lot of new dioceses were formed in the 1920s and afterwards, and these needed new churches. Many churches were upgraded, for example, at Leicester, from the parish church in the town in existing, but some new churches were required, for example, Liverpool and Guildford. Later in the century, other churches were expanded in order to fulfill their cathedral requirements. So the Diocese of St Edmundsbury and Ipswich was actually created in 1913, but the Church of St James was elevated to cathedral status. It really did require expansion in order to fulfill its new role. So after the war in 1945, Stephen Dykes Bower was commissioned to enlarge and extend it. This job lasted for the rest of Dykes Bower's life, and it was finally completed in 2005. It does not, on the face of it, appear to be a 20th century building. Dykes Bower was really heavily interested in the harmony and complementing the existing building. He used a series of fixtures and fittings that fit in with the existing building, using limed oak and stained glass by Goddard and Gibbs. Another cathedral that required extension in the 20th century was St Mary and St Helen Brentwood, the Roman Catholic cathedral. It was the first purpose-built classical cathedral since Wren designed St Paul's Cathedral. Designed by Quinlan Terry and Raymond Erith in 1991. It has both English and Italian influences. Although internally it is completely modern in its layout, it's a completely different concept of how you build a modern 20th century cathedral to this next one, Clifton Cathedral, a fan-shaped design with gem-like glass, dalle de verre glass by Henry Haig. So Clifton rounds up the second part of my talk for a very particular reason. Its claim is that it is the first cathedral in the world to be fully liturgically reformed following the Second Vatican Council of 1962-5. Completed in 1973 and designed by the Sir Percy Thomas Partnership. So Vatican II was the culmination of a great deal of interest in the early church and a considerable study of early liturgical forms that led to the Catholic Church introducing widespread reforms. This last section of my talk will briefly look at the reforms in the liturgy and the effect that they had on the architecture in the 20th century British Church. Monastic institutions on the continent, particularly the Benedictines, were the pioneers in the 19th century of the liturgical reform movement. In Britain, this started to influence the churches surprisingly early, and a lot earlier than has often been recognised. The Church of Our Lady in St Alphege in Bath is an early experiment in using research into early church architecture, and it was built in a response to the increase in the Catholic population in Bath during the 1920s. We're back to Giles Gilbert Scott as the architect. He was commissioned to design this church by the prior of St John's Church, Bath, Don Anselm Rutherford, a Benedictine monk. The style and modelling of the church is on Santa Maria in Cosmedin in Rome, and it was suggested by Don Anselm himself to Scott. This is a truly beautiful little church. Scott later described it as one of his favourite works, calling it his little gem of a church. It was opened in 1929 and wasn't completed at the time due to lack of funds. This church, however, was entirely built considering the early church configuration, and it was the beginning of the re-evaluation of the liturgy and architecture, which would ultimately lead to a complete rethink in church design. Also, during the interwar period, the Church of John Keble, Mill Hill, was designed in a new suburb, another new suburb in North London with an enormously burgeoning population. The dedication of John Keble was to mark the 100th anniversary of the Assize Sermon in Oxford that started the Oxford movement. The remarkable thing about this church is not so much its exterior, as is often the case with 20th century churches, but the interior. This church was designed after a competition, very unusual in the interwar period for churches, and was designed in such a way that the width of the church allowed for the congregation to be completely surrounding the choir and close to the altar. The Church of St Michael in Wythenshawe by Nugent Francis Cashmel Day also dates from the 1930s, and again it is conceived in a way to allow the congregation to be much closer to the altar. It's actually a star-shaped church which allows for that sort of wrapping around of the seating. Originally, the choir was not intended to be in a sort of traditional chancel position, but at the back of the church, due to a debate between the architect and the Bishop of Manchester. The design was changed midway. The next interwar church that shows the influence of the beginnings of the interwar movement is this church, a Roman Catholic church, Our Lady and the First Martyrs in Bradford by Langtry Langton, dating from 1935, which is octagonal in plan with a central altar. This was an early and influential design and was driven again by liturgical considerations. The parish priest was heavily involved in the design of this church, and in fact, he wrote books with Eric Gill, who also designed a church with a central altar before the Second World War at Galston in Norfolk. All these churches were mentioned by the author Peter Hammond in his seminal work, Liturgy and Architecture of 1960, which was to revolutionise church design in Britain. The idea that he put forward was formed of all these different elements that were to coalesce at the Second Vatican Council and change Roman Catholic Church design forever. But Peter Hammond was Church of England priest and was interested in influencing all denominations in their architecture. He was one of the founder members of the New Churches Research Group, who were the earliest proponents of liturgical reform design in Britain. Perhaps their most famous church is that of St Paul's Bow Common, modern church built in 1958-60. Again, the interior is more inspiring perhaps than the exterior. The building is listed Grade 2 star for its huge importance in liturgical reform. The architects were Robert Maguire and Keith Murray. Around the porch is lettering that reads, "Truly this is none other but the house of God, this is the gate of heaven," which was carved by Ralph Bayer. It has an 800 square foot mosaic by Charles Lutyens inside, made from coloured Murano glass, which took 5 years to make. The church is also home at the moment to Lutyens' sculpture, Outraged Christ. The importance of this church is again the idea of the central altar and the gathering of the people around it. It has this lightweight baldacchino over it, which is made to resemble a tent. And the lantern over the top brings the light down, emphasising the sanctuary. There are many, many churches in the 20th century that took this cue in their arrangement from this church, and loads of those are in the book, 100 Churches, 100 Years. So I'm going to leave you now with the last church in that book, and this is actually an abbey church, the Stanbrook Abbey by Field and Clegg Bradley, which is 2015. I know that's not 20th century, but the book covers 100 years from 2014 on from 1914 up to 2014 or 15 as in this case, because that is the remit of the 20th century society who don't believe in finishing off at the end of the 20th century, but can intend to carry on until we get a 21st century church listed, or any 21st century building listed, to be honest. And then we'll see what we do about our name. So thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was a fantastic, fantastic lecture. So everyone, we're going to get into question time shortly, and I'll be bringing Claire back on screen. But that was, I thoroughly enjoyed that. As I said at the start, everyone, it's been really interesting over the last week because we've seen some interesting questions and some interesting comments made about certainly modern churches, and people may have certain assumptions about 20th century architecture. I know I've learned so much from that lecture, so do comment away if your perceptions have been changed, if you have a better appreciation for modern churches as a result of this lecture. Please do comment away. If you are like me and have been converted to 20th century architecture, also please do comment away. I've seen there's been a few comments about the churches in the lecture, and if they are in the book, most of them are in the book. My particular favourite, I was talking to Claire yesterday, and I'm glad some people said it was their favourite as well, is this one. Hopefully you can see it. It's Our Lady and St Alphege in Bath. It's a glorious church. But as I said, this book has got some really, really interesting churches in it that haven't been featured in today's lecture. So if you'd like to learn more about some really beautiful modern churches, do buy the book from us. As I said, the RRP is £25. We're selling it today for a special rate of just £20 plus postage and packaging. Not only do you support our work by buying from us and not some other online retailers, but also if you're buying with us, the 20th Century Society do get royalties from the sales of the books as well. So we're going to be getting into question time, so please do comment away with any questions you have. I've seen a couple of people have joined us for the first time and asking who this is behind me. This, everyone, is Clement. Clement, do you want to say hello? Yeah, there you go, everyone. So you've seen Clement. He joins us nearly every single week. He's more famous than I am, and we may have to get him a social media account of his own soon. But I'm going to jump on with Claire now, and we're going to go into question time. So, Claire, one of the questions that's come in was you talked about one of the barn church at Greenwood, but did you mention another church as well?
Yes, there is another one. You're going to put me on the spot and ask me which one it is, and I've completely forgotten.
It's not a problem. We can come back to that one, don't worry. Sorry, I'm just going through some of the ones here, the questions coming in now. When you looked at Notre Dame de France, the altar wasn't in the centre of the church. Was there a particular reason for why? Because obviously looking at Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, the altar is at the centre. Is there a reason why for that round church it isn't at the centre? Was that too early for the liturgical reforms, perhaps?
Well, I think it's been changed apart from anything. One of the reasons for that is that actually they found at Liverpool that it wasn't the most ideal way of organising your church. So having the altar absolutely in the middle became less common. It became more common to have sort of fan shape. So Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral was actually quite early on, relatively speaking, in the liturgical reform movement. And I'm sure John will explain all about that in great detail when he does his talk in a couple of weeks. But they sort of moved on and decided it didn't work quite as well as they thought it was going to. So actual central altars became, more fan-shaped became the norm.
Thanks, Claire. And another question that's come in here is the Church of the Good Shepherd Woodthorpe on the list in the book?
Church of the Good Shepherd Woodthorpe. I don't think so.
Well, there you go, everyone. It's not on this, but if they do
encyclopedic knowledge,
if they do a revised edition, it might make it onto the list. So there's some other questions. There's quite a few coming in now. The Bath Church is stunning. Curious to know, why was there such an big increase in Roman Catholics in Bath at that time?
Not my specialist subject, I'm afraid.
I know.
Yes, some really interesting questions. I don't know why.
We'll have a look, everyone. But I know, particularly for Liverpool, during the Irish famine, there was a huge flood of Irish immigrants to the city of Liverpool. So that's why Liverpool, the Metropolitan Cathedral there, was funded by the poor Roman Catholic immigrants there because they escaped the potato famine. But I'll try and do some digging as to why Bath may be. Certainly it was used as a spa town, so there was a lot of wealthy, affluent people coming down for spa breaks. What is the most recently built church in England? Are they still building churches, do you know?
Oh, yes. Certainly still building churches. Most recently built, don't know. You're going to ask me questions I don't know. A lot of the trend recently has been to build sort of multi-purpose buildings. So St John's Waterloo, for example, which I showed you, they have a sister church in the parish. I think it's St Peter's, but they'll probably wrap my knuckles for getting it wrong. And just a few years ago, they rebuilt that church and basically built a block of flats with community facilities in the bottom, and the church is built into the bottom of that block rather than having an entirely separate building. So that's an interesting trend, and I believe there's another one being built in North London at the moment, a similar sort of idea. So the idea that church is incorporated into a larger development is becoming quite common.
And that church you mentioned in North London is literally on the same, just on the the Roundway in Tottenham, where I'm based. It's just on literally right a bus stop away from me. And yeah, it's being built. That's being built. We obviously had Tottenham Hale development was built. It's called the Engine Room. St Francis Engine Room was built a couple of years ago. And then
right.
in the 80s, there was a fire up on the Haringey ladder. I think it's St Paul's Haringey. The Victorian church burned down. And they built this really striking church. Very classical,
That's
it almost looks. And that is in the book. So yeah, certainly in North London, I'm quite blessed with some modern churches near us. Claire, here's a really, it's going to be a tough question, I'm afraid, but what's your favourite 20th century church and why?
Oh, gosh. That's not fair. It's like asking what your favourite book is. What's my favourite 20th century church and why? My favourite 20th century church is St Nicholas Burnage in Manchester, which was the first church designed and built by Cashmale Day, who is my favourite church architect. Reason it's my favourite is because it divided people so completely. There's a lovely picture, a news clipping in the Manchester archives of somebody who's annotated a picture of it to make it look like a gasometer because they think it's so ugly. But it was so incredibly carefully thought out by Cashmale Day. He worked with the parish to think of everything that they needed and the way that they wanted their church to be. And I think it sort of sets the wheels in motion for everything that was to happen throughout the 20th century. And I think still is happening with churches trying to provide spaces for the community and what people actually want.
And do you think, well, obviously I said earlier that you've made a convert out of me to 20th century architecture. Is there a particular reason why you think 20th century architecture and perhaps 20th century churches get such a bad press?
Well, I think an awful lot of it is just because they're a bit recent. So if you think about the way that Victorian churches were so heavily denigrated until a relatively few years ago, and people have discovered them and discovered how incredibly beautiful and interesting they are. And the same thing is happening with 20th century architecture. We're just that few years behind. It's just a fashion thing, really. These things take time.
One question that's come in is what is the biggest Roman Catholic church in England? Now, I don't know, but I would hazard a guess it's either going to be Westminster Cathedral or Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. Now, interestingly, we're going to do a lecture in 2 weeks with one of the architects who helps look after the Metropolitan Cathedral. The original design, we're going to talk about the original design because it was designed by Lutyens and it would have been the second largest church in the world. The dome of St. Peter's Basilica would have fit inside the dome of the Liverpool Cathedral as it would have been. It would have sat, I believe, 15,000 people originally. When the Gilbert's design was proposed, that was designed to have 3,000 people, but then they scaled it back to 2,000 people. If that was built in the 20th century, we can definitely say Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral would have been the biggest, being able to seat 15,000 people. What do you think the future of architecture for churches is going to be? Because you showed in 2015 that really interesting wooden panelled from a convent, I believe it was. Do you think there's any particular trends we're going to see going forward for future churches being built?
I think it's really difficult just because there's not enough volume of them, really.
And that's an interesting point actually, that fewer churches are being built. Because you obviously also come from a conservation background, Claire, are 20th century churches in need of conservation? And actually, is it quite difficult to conserve a 20th century church as opposed to a medieval church?
Well, I don't think it's any more difficult as such. I think people have different expectations. 20th century churches have roofs that leak just like medieval churches do. They need upkeep and maintenance. They need people to love them and look after them. So in that respect, they're no different to any other church. They did use a certain amount of experimental materials, but not as widely as some other building types, because the church is quite often pretty conservative in its uptake of new materials. It liked to make sure that they were going to have a longevity before they took them on. But it's the same really for 20th century churches as for many churches. It's just raising the funds to do the work. Many of these churches, of course, are located in areas that are relatively deprived. So it's not an easy ask. But there's certainly a lot of churches in great need of help. And I don't think that situation is going to improve.
Thanks, Claire. And I suppose closing remarks really are, you obviously you look after or you're the head of casework for churches at the 20th Century Society. What's the most challenging aspect you think churches are facing, sort of particularly 20th century churches are facing at the moment?
Well, as I said, I think it's funding and having enough people to do all the jobs that need doing in the church. Really, as I said, it's the same for 20th century churches as it is for all. The particular thing that I find with 20th century churches is people can often start off with a bit of an attitude that their building is a millstone around their neck. One of the joys that I find of doing church casework is going out and talking to people, and really they want to see a way forward, and they often come out really loving their buildings in a way and seeing their buildings in a way that they didn't before. And that's the particularly uplifting part of the job that I enjoy.
Thank you so much, Claire. And that brings us, everyone, to the end of question time and the end of this lunchtime lecture today. As again, thank you so much, Claire. That was a fantastic lecture. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for the amazing questions. We've really enjoyed the comments over last week and particularly today about these churches. So please do keep them coming if you're watching over the weekend or again in the future, because we do keep an eye on those comments. And if you've got any questions, please do keep them coming, because we'll try and get answers for you. Now, just a couple of announcements. Next week is a really fantastic week because we are celebrating 1 year of lunchtime lectures, and we're going to be doing something a bit special to celebrate. And there's going to be a bit of competition going with a really interesting prize that we think you'll love. So please do make sure you join us at the same time next Thursday. We'll post a link on our Facebook page over the coming days with further information about that. And that's going to be on about cathedral cloisters, remarkable survivors. And we're looking at some really interesting cloisters in the UK that survived the Reformation. Then the following week after that, if you've enjoyed today's lecture, do join us in 2 weeks' time, because we're joined by John Wright, who's a heritage consultant at Purcell Architecture, who look after Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. And he's going to be talking to us about how the cathedral came to be built and some of the conservation challenges they faced there. So do join us for that. Now, if you are a member, again, for the second week in June, we're looking at Lutyens' proposed designs for the cathedral, with some really interesting cutting-edge research that's been carried out by the Liverpool School of Architecture, who've done some digital reconstruction work on the plans Lutyen drew up. So we're going to be looking at how the space basically would have looked if it was built. But that's a member-exclusive lecture. So if you're a member with us, you'll get an invitation to come to that. But it will be recorded if you can't make it live. Now, if you would like to become a member with us, as we said at the start, we've got a special membership offer at the moment. If you join us by direct debit from just £3.50 per month, and if you use the offer code LECTURE, and that's lecture in capitals at the checkout, you will get a free copy of this wonderful book, The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals, Decoding Sacred Symbolism of Christianity's Holy Spaces, which is made, should I say, is written by Dr. Richard Stemp. And I said, the images throughout are breathtaking, and it's a really great guide. What I've really enjoyed about it is, again, sort of how you can read different stained glass windows, and it's a great little rucksack-sized book that you can take with you, so you can decode churches when you can start going out, and hopefully when you can start going abroad as well, looking at some international churches. But that's, as I said, if you join us from my member from direct debit, from just £3.50 a month, you'll get that for free. And as I said, if you want to buy today's special book, which is edited by Clare, and as I said, most of the churches Clare spoke about today are in this book, as well as a great deal, many more. You can buy it from us from just £20 plus purchase packaging. I think that's enough from me today. But if you've got any questions, anyone, please do keep commenting. Send us a message. But but we look forward to seeing you at a future lunchtime lecture. But again, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us for another Thursday lunchtime lecture. Have a great week.